There has been a lot of Warhammer 40,000 tournament data coming in from across the world, and it is this data, as well as information Games Workshop gathers themselves, that will inform what they have changed in the January balance patch and Dataslate. I say January balance patch because that is when it's supposed to come out, even though I'm recording this on the 30th of January. So anyway, here is a wall of data. Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory, so if you could just click that like button, we can all be on our way. Okay, this is dense. There are a lot of stats here calculated by the people at Goonhammer.com. I've left a link to their site in the description, so if you want to see any of these numbers in more detail and how they've broken it down, that is where you'll want to go. I found that just looking at this massive numbers doesn't really help explain what's going on, so I'll explain what it means for us. And by us, I mainly mean Genestealer Cult and Sisters players, who will each be getting a new video from me once the balance patch and points actually drop from Games Workshop. This data covers tournaments from the start of December 2023 to the 25th of January 2024. This at the bottom is not the easiest date to understand internationally. Please use the name of the month rather than the number of the month. That makes it so much easier. For the number of players, Necrons have a really big showing. That's very understandable, as they just got a new codex with a lot of new ways to play. If you're wondering why they outstripped the Admech, who also just got a new codex, Necrons were in the 9th edition starter set, and so have much more affordable models that are much easier to paint compared to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Genestealer cults had 30 players who submitted armies to these tournaments, which is a very low 1.1% of tournament players. Boy, I really picked the moneymaker faction to talk about, didn't I? Only the Death Watch had a lower turnout. So if you hear me say in the future something like, Genestealer cult has the second smallest player base, or is the second least played faction, this is where I get my information from for that statistic. The Sisters of Battle are 3.1% of armies at these tournament events, with most factions being in the 3 to 4% range. So the Sisters of Battle are pretty averagely represented. For Goonhammer's calculations of how well a faction is doing in the meta, they compare the percentage of armies that get into the potential winning positions compared to the number of those armies at the tournament events. That is the final ratio. So TwIP, or tournaments in winning position, it counts the number of times a player at a grand tournament sized event won their first 4 games. They potentially could have won the event and were in sort of the final, even though the true final would be the 2 higher scoring players who are competing against each other. If you're winning all your games, you're doing really well as a tournament army. So this isn't just measuring tournament victors, but all the armies that went undefeated in battle, at least until the final games, and had an overall lower total score than the final victor or armies that lost their final games, but otherwise they did really well. If you only counted tournament winners, then you would miss out all the people at larger events who never lost a game. So a good TwIP would be 1. A ratio of 1 would be perfect. And Goonhammer's example is, if Space Marine armies made up half the armies at the tournament, then you would expect half their players to be in a position to win those events, with probably half the events being won by Marines. Now that wouldn't mean that Space Marines are OP if they're winning half the events, just that lots of people play them, and that is why their win rate is so high. So this measurement for Genestealer Cult should show that 1% of players about to play their final game had a score that could win the tournament if their final game goes well. And there are a lot more numbers here and a lot more behind the scenes. This is why generally I prefer Games Workshop's less accurate but easier to understand percentage charts, though the Goonhammer way eliminates a lot of casual lists, silly lists, players that are not familiar with tournament play, and it focuses on the top tables to see who can get there. If Codex Zotes came along and was horribly underpowered, but 50 people played it as a joke, they would still play like 5 games in the tournament and may end up with a final 30% win rate, partly from winning at the lower tables at the end of the tournament against meme lists and newbie players. So Games Workshop would show the real win rate as 30%, while Goonhammer would show 0 as their TwIP. Horribly underpowered because none of these hypothetical 50 players were ever in a position where they could win the tournament. The reason that Games Workshop takes data from tournaments that are looking at percentages of players, not just winners, is that this is better if you want to try and account for casual games that aren't reported, but they still get their information from tournaments, which is skewed towards meta lists anyway. Now you can see that Grey Knights, Black Templars and World Eaters are about right. That is despite the Grey Knights not having a lot of anti-tank, the World Eaters having a very, very small unit roster, and the Black Templars having the cheapest Space Marines in existence. So if Games Workshop uses data like this, we're unlikely to see too many changes when this balance patch actually drops. Chaos Space Marines are doing really well. They have a very nice detachment rule and a really nice army rule. Cultists, and a lot of different cultists, are doing well because any of them can have lethal hits, which makes a mockery of high toughness. But when we compare this army rule to something like the Deathwatch detachment rule, Deathwatch get lethal hits, or sustained hits, or precision for all their units, but only once per game. The Chaos Space Marines can have that whenever they want, and can have it in different ways. So if a Chaos Space Marine unit needed to get through some chaff to charge something valuable, they could get sustained hits on their shooting, and then when they charge in against the more valuable unit, they can get lethal hits in combat. Deathwatch, despite being a Space Marine versatile army, is not that versatile, because you need to pick your special rule in the command phase. That has a lot more forward planning involved. So Deathwatch may need a better detachment rule or a points drop on the Deathwatch specific units. We don't want to see a points drop on Space Marine units generally. They are doing about right. Let's also take a quick look at Chaos Daemons. I mentioned in my hope for changes that they stop being a source for cheap units for Chaos armies and can just hold their own as their own faction. But they're struggling a lot on their own. Only one of the 50 players who played Chaos Daemons got in a position where they could have won the tournament. Now, it will depend if Games Workshop takes data like this into account. Their own metrics had Chaos Daemons doing about right, and that's why I thought, okay, they'll maybe change up Nurglings, which are taken by other Chaos factions, and they'll do something to make the Slaaneshi Demonettes and the Khorne Bloodlighters a bit better. More drastic action may be required, but they at least had 50 players. The difficulty when Genestealer Cult only had 30 players is that it is hard to get a rounded 1% of it. I'm not saying this is a bad metric to go by, but it doesn't work well for small factions. In previous editions, Genestealer Cult were a very high skill army, and so very few players took them to tournaments, but those that did often overperformed. This time, only one Genestealer Cult list finished a tournament without a loss, but with these metrics, Genestealer Cult are underperforming as a faction. Slightly. I get 0.27 as the number. So Goonhammer may have done some rounding, or there's a lot more information in the back that is just pie charts and denseness, and I'm trying to explain this table so you understand the meta, not anything that's going on behind, which is far too confusing for people who aren't studying advanced mathematics or statistics. One of them. If we have any statisticians in the comments, please help us out. But the Sisters of Battle are doing much better at 1.52 when rounded, so for this number of players, they're doing well. The Sisters have a lot of different combos that can be used and units that perform in different jobs they can change between. Versatility is really good in 10th edition. So, Death Cult Assassins. They can go in and try and assassinate a character with their precision attacks. They can be a cheap unit to stand on objectives in the late game and score primaries when a lot of other bigger units are dead. At any time they can complete secondaries while more expensive units are doing the fighting. And they can save the bacon of one of those important units by charging in and using suffering and sacrifice to force enemy models to target them instead. This is nasty on elites. It is horrifying on single models like Angron, who can no longer carve up a battle tank, they can just crush a pair of cheap models. Speaking of vehicles, the Sisters Castigator and Exorcist are comboing very nicely with the Triumph of St. Catherine. So the Triumph can choose 2 relics. If they choose Simulacrum of the Argent Shroud, then the Castigator rapid fire cannons are firing more shots. And if you use the Simulacrum of the Ebon Chalice, that's really good for the Exorcist. Because when it's firing its missiles, if you're firing indirectly, you can definitely hit with at least one of them, or you can change the damage of missiles that get through the enemy to the highest number of miracle dice you have available. So it is possible to do a flat 12 damage to the enemy, assuming you get 2 missiles to any invulnerable saves. That's going to be taking out most vehicles. So for the balance patch, I am expecting there to be changes to the Triumph points, or the vehicle points, or if Games Workshop wants to take a more direct approach, stop the Triumph affecting vehicles and have it only affect infantry units. Other units that may change in points are the Arco-Flagellants and so the very similar Repentia. Sisters have an excellent tar pit from Arco-Flagellants. They do okay damage, but with 2 wounds and a feel no pain of 4+, they are great for tying up scary enemy models. The Genestealer Cult have the Pure Strain Genestealers for this, a unit I advocate for a lot, which doesn't come up much at tournament lists, but that is partly because they cost 170 points, which prior to the January balance patch of 2024 is 40 points more for the same number of Arco-Flagellants. And you're swapping the Feel No Pain for an invulnerable save. So the Genestealer cults are showing up with the same kinds of lists with the same good units. My tier list explains which ones are good and why they're taken with this detachment, And don't miss out on other Sisters combos used in winning lists. I've explained before how they work. We can only hope that the balance patch was delayed because Games Workshop's figuring out how to return Celestians. My darlings and viewers, have a great day with the numbers of 40k.